Hello and welcome to another update. In this one we'll be giving an in-depth overview of everything that's happening on the front line. However, before we get into it, I've done an update to my Patreon where there are now only two tiers, a $5 tier and a $10 tier. So the $5 tier gets an exclusive Patreon only video every Wednesday, and the $10 version gets an exclusive live stream with audience participation every Sunday just for Patreon supporters, and also the exclusive video that comes for the $5 version. And that is the two segments I have. So make sure to join if you want to support me and get some extra content. The starting out will be starting in the southern part of the front line, where fighting continues by Holodar. So to the ones who haven't seen, I made a video about Holodar where I essentially analyzed the Russian offensive that happened there in early February and exactly what happened and so on. So essentially, this part of the front line, there was a lot of back and forth. The Russian forces advanced, tried to enter, took the southern Dacha areas, the eastern Dacha area, and even advanced towards the coal mine. However, in the end, they managed to only hold this territory after they were continuously being pushed back. At some point, the Ukrainians even took half of the Dacha area here to the south. However, today, this is what the front line looks like. The fighting itself doesn't actually happen on the front line. However, there's just mostly artillery back and forth with some Russian glide bombs and bombs, FAB 500s, hitting Holodar now. So before that, it was mostly just artillery shells. So now we see a lot of back and forth with the artillery and bombs, with not a lot of ground attacks, but there are some, as they do some positional battles here and there in the western and eastern parts. As for the Novomikhailivka to Marinka area, so by Novomikhailivka there's a lot of the same as Holodar, some positional battles but mostly artillery back and forth. As for Pobieda, there was a sudden thrust into the village a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I think it's a couple of months ago now. So the Russian forces managed to capture this eastern part and held it. And then there's been a lot of back and forth fighting. There's no opportunity for the Russian forces to actually continue attacking, as they have this large open field they have to cross through, which means that it's difficult for them to send supplies, send new troops and so on. So they are just having the minimum here presence so that they have a foothold for when they launch an attack in the future. But essentially this is the current situation here. As for Marinka, there's a lot of street fighting, similar to Bakhmut. However, here it is so devastated that there's essentially no cover for any advances. So most of the western part of the city is actually in the gray zone, as the Russian forces and Ukrainian forces do artillery battles from the edge of the city and to the Russian positions here. And then there's a slow advance where Russian forces actually send tanks to advance, and then they fight with those tanks to get some new footholds. They've managed to capture this western area of the city, as well as the dentist office and most parts here by the center of the city, as well as this breakthrough here to the north and by the warehouse, as they've gained a foothold in the northern parts. So essentially the situation here is a lot of back and forth, street fighting, armored vehicles, anti-tank guns and so on. So a lot of heavy fighting in general and a lot of shelling as well. Then we go to the Nevelska area, where here there's a lot of positional fighting as the Russian forces try to reach the village and the Ukrainian forces manage to hold them back because of their heavy equipment and weaponry here in this area. As for the Pervomaiska area, we see the Russian forces attacking both the north and the south, as well as somewhat gradual advance here in the center. If you look at the recap map, you can see gradual advance to the south, north and center as the Russian forces attempt to advance in this area. So my assumption would be that the Russian forces are looking to capture this northern area and then use this bridgehead to cross into the southern part, which will allow them to push onwards to the river line, and then they will aim to capture the rest of the village. However, this is also a very slow grind, as there's heavy forces of the Ukrainian forces defending, and the Russian forces simply aren't numerous enough to launch proper offensives in this area, so there's a lot of positional battles here as well. As for the FDK area, so the fighting here started with a sudden breakthrough here to the north, where the Russian forces captured Krasnoarivka and then pushed towards Stepove at Berdishi, after which the Ukrainian forces have managed to recapture this rail line, which is an important supply line to FDK. And at the same time, we saw fighting here to the south, where there's this trench network here to the west and to the east. Fighting takes place by the eastern one, and Russian forces have captured the western one. So there's a lot of heavy fighting here to the southwest of Avdiivka. Fighting also continues by Kamianka. Some sources reported a Russian capture of it, but I've not received confirmation from any of my main sources, which means I still have it as fighting occurring within the village. Then we move on to the Kreminna front, where here we see the Russian forces attack all the way from Makivka and down to Spirne. And I say this because it is essentially the same type of fighting on the whole front line. So there's a lot of positional fighting where Russian forces' tactics is actually active defense, which means that they are holding their line and then expecting Ukrainian attacks. If the Ukrainian forces start attacking the Russian positions, then they push them back. And if they manage to push them back, then they'll advance a little bit. But most of the time, they just repel their attacks and hold their positions. So that is the situation on this whole front line. There's the same tactics ongoing. As for the Serbiansky forest area, there's a lot of close quarter combats here with both PMPs as well as tanks and foot soldiers advancing within the forest line in between the forests as they attempt to increase their foothold and advance slightly. Sometimes there's slight advances, like the Russian forces capturing this part right here, which is a small part. But to capture this part, there was a lot of heavy fighting. We have seen the BMP Terminator as well as T-90Ms in action here on this part of the front line, which means that it is a very important part of the front line for the Russian forces, and they are doing their best to actually hold these positions and push the Ukrainians back. As for Bilorivka, here there's been a lot of back and forth. The Russian forces captured most of the village, then they were pushed out past with their old positions, and then they've pushed back to these positions for now. So that's the situation for Bilorivka. As for Yochno-Klemensk and Spirne, again, there's a bit of back and forth. Russian forces captured this area here to the north, and this oil depot here to the east of Spirne, and that is it for the past few months. As for the Bakhmut front itself, fighting continues by the E40 Highway, and here it is a difficult situation for the Russians, because although they have their eastern flank secured by capturing Selesnyansk, there's still some Ukrainian positions in some hills here to the north of it. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces still hold on to the whole Vasilivka, even though it's been split in half. So there's no proper fortifications in the flanks, and at the same time, these three villages, which is a three-village chain, which is the defensive line of the Ukrainian forces here on this part of the front line, they are located on the high ground, which means that the Russian forces have to advance on the high ground to advance further by the E40 Highway, which means that it's very difficult for them to advance in this part of the front. As for the south of the whole Vasilivka, fighting continues by this forest patch here, which means that it's fighting similar to the Serbiansky forest area, with a lot of heavy fighting, close quarter combat, and a lot of trenches within the forest line of infantry, so that whenever infantry advance, they will be able to ambush them with their trenches in the forest line. As for the Rumovo road, the 00506 road, the Russian forces recently did a breakthrough where they managed to capture most of the trenches here to the north of the road. As for the rest of the trenches, they are in the gray zone, which means that the Russian forces have managed to cut off the supply line. However, they do not have a proper foothold on it, and the Ukrainian forces are still contesting it. But in the essence of it, it is difficult for the Ukrainians to use it to transport supplies or reinforcements, as the Russian forces ambush them whenever they arrive. So the Russian forces are here attempting to gain full control over the trenches to gain a proper foothold and attack Romove from the northwest. At the same time, the Russian forces are attacking here to the north of Romove, where they are attempting to gain control over the village and take full control over the area. As for the northern parts of Bakhmut, the only part left is the western part of the city. There's the southwest, northwest, and the center west. So in the center west, there's a high-rise complex, apartment complex area with a lot of high-rise buildings. So someone called it a citadel. I'll go with that name. So this is the citadel of the Ukrainian forces in the city. It is their last defensive point. This one is heavily fortified. There's a lot of high-rise buildings, essentially a three-line defensive line here to the east, multiple layers of defensive buildings, as well as in the schools, colleges, and so on. So this is a heavily fortified area of the city, and the Ukrainian forces are trying to hold it at all costs. Then we see here to the southwest of the city, where the Ukrainian forces are being pushed back consistently. They had this fortification here, the industrial faculty, and the Russian force managed to capture it 2 days ago. So the current situation is that the Russian forces now hold the most fortified area of the southwestern part, And then there's the secondary fortified area, which is this high-rise buildings here. And this building actually blew up. So this position has been weakened. So most likely we'll see the Russian forces capture this part as well. So essentially we'll be seeing a lot of fighting here to the southwest to cut off the southern supply route into and out of the Citadel. And then in the northwestern part, the Ukrainian forces will most likely establish a defensive line here. So the Russian forces will have to push through and break through this defensive line to cut off this supply line here, which will completely cut off the Ukrainian forces from any supplies within the Citadel. And generally there's a lot of frontline assaults by the Russian forces, as fighting has now reached the Citadel area and entered it. As the Russian forces yesterday captured this area here, the rest of the garage area, which was another Ukrainian defensive position, and this area here, they captured most of it, including the Bakhmut Medical College and the Artemovsk office for gas supply. So there's a lot of fighting here in the southern part as well. So the Citadel area is being attacked from the north and the east and the south, while fighting continues to the northwest to cut off the supply route, and to the southwest to cut off the supply right there as well. So that is the current situation within the city, and that is the situation on the whole front line. That is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.